Welcome to Inside Out, a classification and corrections podcast produced by Equivon Corrections, where we discuss industry trends, hot button issues, and solutions that impact facilities nationwide with thought leaders from around the country. Let's get into it.
Hello, everyone. This is Priscilla Torres, project manager at Equivon Corrections and your host of Inside Out. Welcome to today's episode, where we're diving into a topic that's at the heart of every county jail, but doesn't always get the attention it deserves: change management. County jails face constant shifts, new policies, new technology, staffing challenges, and pressure from courts, commissioners, and the community. Unlike state prisons, jails deal with rapid turnover of both inmates and staff, making any kind of change feel like moving a mountain. So, how do leaders and staff successfully adapt to these changes without losing sight of safety, security, and daily operations? What strategies work to get buy-in from the front line? And how can county jails make sure new initiatives stick instead of slipping back into the old way of doing things? We'll explore those questions and more with today's guest, Joe Costanzo, superintendent at the Hillsborough County Department of Corrections. Welcome, Joe. Thank you so much for joining us today on today's episode.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad to be here.
Joe, for those that don't know you or don't know much about your background, could you share a little bit about how you got to where you are today?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, Joe Costanzo. I'm the superintendent in Hillsborough County Department of Corrections in New Hampshire. I started my career in corrections in 2009. I'd gotten out of college. I had a degree in criminal justice sociology. Didn't kind of really knew what I wanted to do. When I graduated, I ended up joining the National Guard. And when I first arrived at my first unit duty station, there was a guy there that worked at Merrimack County Jail up in the state of New Hampshire. And, through conversations, he said, hey, our jail's looking to hire, as we're always looking to hire people, as we all know throughout our field. So I said, okay. So actually, I was looking at the state prison and I ended up applying to the county jail. I got hired, and I didn't know what to expect. I figured, hey, it might be just a few years here, then end up potentially moving on to a police department, or moving on to a sheriff's department. Because in the state of New Hampshire, the county jails are governed by our county commissioners. The sheriffs don't govern the jails, which is pretty unique. So we are appointed. So the superintendents are appointed. We're not elected officials, but we are appointed by our elected officials. So when I was there, I started in 2009. I got deployed not too long after that for a year overseas to Afghanistan. And when I got back, just the culture in the organization and the people there just made me stay. And when not too long after that, I ended up getting promoted, and it's my first supervisory position, which was a corporal. And then through the time, I just ended up getting promoted I was a sergeant, and then I moved up to captain. And when I got to captain is really when I started understanding what organizational change is. And really, we can talk about that in a few minutes, but and I can tell you about that. But then let's fast forward. I ended up, I was a major at the facility. Then I was a superintendent. And then a year later, after being a superintendent, an opportunity came up at the largest jail in the state of New Hampshire. And they were looking for a superintendent. And through conversations with my family and some of my mentors, I ended up down here. And every day is a new day in corrections.
So as I mentioned before, our today's topic will be about change management. So when we talk about change management, and change management exists in several areas, right? Mm-hmm. But in a county jail setting, what does that really mean?
So when you're looking at change management, I think from a perspective of a county jail, you're looking at multiple things. You're looking at policies, procedures, as you talked about, but really the biggest crux of change management is really the culture within the organization. That, from my perspective, that culture is the foundation to the organization, and the understanding of human behavior within the organization that affects the inputs that affect each other, both staff relationships and also staff inmate interactions and inmate behavior. And there's a lot of influences that influence culture. A lot of them, like as you mentioned in the beginning too, are not something that we have a lot of control over, whether that be policies, implementations, standards, or federal standards, or case law. Case law is another big one that can define change management. But it's how leaders approach it. And it's how you approach the change management, your understanding of the environment that you're in, and your understanding of where you want to go ultimately.
So you said something interesting regarding culture, right? And you're referring to the subculture, right, that exists within the organization, right? So oftentimes, we hear, well, that's just how we've always done things, right? Yeah. That's like the number one thing. So how does one go about making those changes? I know you've spent some time at, I think you were at a different facility, right, prior to coming to your current facility. And I'm sure that wasn't an easy change for the staff to see somebody new coming in and then trying to implement new changes, right? So how do you go about kind of changing that subculture that kind of exists within a facility?
So I think the best way to describe it and the approach, I kind of want to just touch base back on my first experience and in management and having the ability. And I say in management, it's because when I was in management, there was a significant change in culture within the organization I started in, and there was a new individual that came in, and that was the superintendent, and we really changed and defined what that facility's mission, vision, and values were, over a period of time. And as I moved on in my career, there was a lot of sleepless nights. There was a lot of difficult conversations and everything. But ultimately, in the end, the vision was worth it. And when the staff got to where they needed to be, it was they should be proud of it. So when I got down here, I guess what I would say, and we talked a little bit before we came on, is, you can look at things like technology. When I got down to my current place that I'm in now, we were still handwriting logs, and there was a lot of tenured individuals here, very knowledgeable supervisors, very, they had been around 20, 25 years. And, they did things, a certain way. And there's not a right way and a wrong way necessarily to do or to do these things or to run an operation, as long as you're within the constraints and guidelines of the laws. But really it's where do you want to bring the organization to?
County jails differ from prison facilities. Sometimes people kind of confuses the two. We know they're very different, right? But what would you say are some of the biggest barriers to implementing change in a county jail or in county jails, period?
I think you need to understand what you can control as, the leader in the organization, or even from being just an officer and, mid-level supervisor, to really anybody in the organization. And realize that, just small changes make a big impact on things. So, I guess the some of the hangups can be, whether it comes to funding or it comes to uh, the biggest challenge, I think, with change is not necessarily an external factor. I think it's mostly the internal factor, and that is the buy-in from your staff.
So as I mentioned, like county jails differ from
Mm-hmm.
prisons, right? And I think one of the biggest differences, for me, anyways, I feel like prison facilities kind of worked at a slower pace and you kind of knew what to expect, right? And jails kind of were quote unquote rock and roll. You're constantly moving, there's a lot of, you know, turnover with not just staff, but also inmates, right?
Yep.
So how does the high turnover of both staff and inmates affect the way change needs to be managed?
Well, I think it's also an opportunity. So I think let's talk about staff first, and
Okay.
that high turnover of staff. I mean, it's true. The world saw a complete shift in the workforce, through COVID, and we're on our way out of that, regards to the workforce, but the staffing challenges we had just to get people in the door, and the want to be part of the law enforcement community, just wasn't there for a real long time. But over time, I've seen that start. It's really starting to shift right now, and I consistently say to our management team and to our mid managers, this is your opportunity. This is your opportunity to define and implement the changes that you have endured, in the past 2 years, 3 years now, and define, because they don't know any other way. They don't know the old way of doing things. So in regards to the high turnover, the biggest challenge with that, I think, is, you're constantly trying to retrain staff, and
Right.
you have a very young workforce, and experience. And if they aren't trained in the proper way to do things, and it's not unrealistic that in today's jails, and I don't think anybody that listens to this can say any different, but you might have individuals that have been here for a year and a half that are looking at supervisory roles just because they're leaders in the organization, right? And
Right.
they're training the new hires coming in, and you need to just make sure that they're doing it the way that they're supposed to be doing it, right? And the turnover for inmates, that's very challenging. We have the two largest cities in New Hampshire, and we have a large, homeless population, unhoused population, shall I say?
Sure.
We're close to the Massachusetts border. And so we do see a lot of turnover, which varies from what the prison sees, right? So we see people at their absolute worst. When they're coming off the street, I mean, I haven't heard that term, rock and roll, but when they're coming off the street from a fresh arrest, you have to understand, and the new officers have to understand. I mean, you're asking these individuals who are 18, 19, 20-year-old individuals to be mental health workers, to talk to these individuals, to be able to identify significant medical conditions for these individuals coming off the street, de-escalate situations. That sometimes attributes to people saying, hey, I don't know if I want to do this.
Absolutely.
So really the two correlate, right? The constant turnover of that population coming in and coming out. What do we do about and the staff? It makes change difficult. When people join organizations, there's a bunch of different theories out there on human behavior, but ultimately they all boil down to they want to feel appreciated.
Heard.
They want to feel heard. They obviously want to be compensated. Those are the basic things, but they want to have an input into their working environment and what they're doing on a day-to-day basis. And let's kind of just really quick shift back to the inmate population. Our goal is to reduce that recidivism, right?
Absolutely.
I personally think that jails across the country are highly underutilized when it comes to our substance misuse programming or our in-house jail programming. It's not really favorable. I mean, because you're still looking at might necessarily be the least restrictive way to provide treatment to individuals, but it can be very successful. And ultimately that's what our goal is. And everything we do here at this organization is to provide people the resources to be successful upon their release.
It's really about how much, you can kind of let staff know that they're doing a great job,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that they're heard, that they're seen, but then at the same time, you're dealing with this challenging population in a short period of time,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because they're in and out. So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, absolutely. And that kind of leads me to my next
Mm-hmm.
question for you. Like, you said something important. You're at a larger facility, right? One of the largest facilities there in your state, which is New Hampshire. In smaller county jails with limited resources, for those listening, right? What makes change especially difficult for them?
I guess we have a very close. There's 10 county jails in New Hampshire. There's 10 counties. Obviously, New Hampshire isn't a giant state, but each county jail has a superintendent, and we meet monthly. It's called an affiliate meeting. We have the ability to meet in person because, again, it's not a huge state. But some of the challenges that I hear from the smaller facilities is funding. County jails are funded off the taxpayers and the tax base here in New Hampshire. So that is usually a challenge. They have a smaller group to pick from, for their staffing. Coas County in New Hampshire, there's a lot of woods up there, and it's way up north, right on the Canadian border. And that can be challenging. Somebody's got to drive an hour and a half because they're still in the same county just to go to work. Right.
Right.
So that's a challenge. So those smaller jails, I mean, I've been blessed blessed. I've been in two of the, I would say, medium to, and then this is the largest jail, which really, again, I guess I would say I've been blessed to have amazing commissioners to work for that just support change. And that's another thing that can challenge any jail in New Hampshire, is, you're ultimately, the superintendent reports to the commissioners, and, you have to be able to justify that change, justify it, and justify the funding for that change to happen. Because ultimately they're the decision maker.
Inside Out, a classification and corrections podcast, is brought to you by the professionals at Equivant Corrections. As a team composed of former corrections practitioners, Equivant Corrections provides specialized classification and custody management solutions. From the industry-backed, proven decision tree classification instrument to alternative screenings and robust reporting capabilities, Equivant Corrections provides dedicated solutions to help facilities and corrections departments nationwide become safer and more streamlined. To learn more or schedule a demo today, visit www.equivant-corrections.com.
So I know earlier you kind of mentioned like the biggest, challenge that you face is really on implementing change inside a county jail, right? You said it's internally, right? It's not necessarily externally. So with that said, how do you get frontline staff to buy into new policies or technology when they already feel overworked? I mean, you said something important earlier regarding COVID and the staff turnover and the issues that we all faced. I mean, I'd like to forget that part, of my career, because it was probably one of the most challenging times. You had no one to turn to, because even my predecessors or, just anyone, they had never experienced anything like that. And these were individuals that had been in corrections for over 20 years. So, you know, people were feeling overworked. So, I hear this time and time again, and I see it, but how do you get frontline staff to buy into like new policies or technology? I mean, they're already tired of working that mandatory overtime. So
yeah, and again, you described it perfectly. They're tired, and the staff are tired, and the staff here in Hillsborough, I every day I'm appreciative of the new hire that just walked in the building to the person who's been here for 29 years. They do things and they respond appropriately, whether we have 5 hospital duties on top of our normal daily staffing. They make it happen, right? But it's a very big point, or very valid point, that trying to implement change in an already tired environment is not an easy task. But I think I kind of want to reel it back just a little bit, to there's this, and I say this now because I'm currently in a program, and we were just talking about McGregor's theory Y and theory X, right? And how managers observe their people. Theory X more explains that managers perceive their staff as inherently lazy, right? And as they don't necessarily want to do their jobs. But then theory Y is that managers perceive their staff as, hard workers, that they want to do a good job. And when you talk about implementing change in an organization, you have to view them like that, right? You have to view your staff as wanting to make change. Did you communicate it properly? Did you explain the why? Do you explain? That is the biggest thing, and I take that from the Army. Back when I was in the Army, and talk about an organization that sometimes you just didn't know why, right? You get told to do things, but and you just did them. But ultimately, the leadership focus, even then in the Army, was to tell them the why. Tell them the why they're doing things, and I've tried to keep that throughout my career. So, implementing change on an already tired staff, it really boils down to your communication and how and your outlook as a manager. If they understand the why, then it's easier. So one of the changes we made here, you talked about technology a little bit earlier, is when I got here, technology, it just the way we've always done things, right? And that's fine, but we're handwriting a lot of stuff. And if those of you who are in facilities are maybe shaking your head saying, yeah, we're still handwriting things, but most facilities have moved to technology, and technology can be a force multiplier when it comes to your staff. And we moved on to essentially what we call now and is known throughout the corrections industry as Guardian. And what it is, for those of you who don't know it, is it's essentially a cell phone that the staff do all their rounds on. They log all their checks. It makes their job easier, right? When you're talking about somebody working 16 hours, a straight, going home, coming back and working 16 hours, I think the last thing that they want to do is be handwriting logs for the last 16 hours and then having to go back and rewrite them because they had a spelling error, right? Or because they they messed up a time. Or so when you're implementing change, look at things that are going to help them and make their lives out there a little bit easier.
What I heard you say is really telling staff why,
Mm-hmm.
why it's important that, you follow these new policies, or why we're shifting to this new technology, right? And just kind of, that helps kind of get the buy-in. And
you can't lead change out of fear, right? Because people will never give you their 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 feedback. They won't sincere feedback, shall I say, right? Because they're just going to try to. Well, he's the superintendent. We're going to do what he says. That's not the way. That's not the way you're going to grow your organization.
Many county jails are moving to digital tools like jail management systems, electronic medical records. Some of them have body worn cameras. You mentioned, a tool that you guys are currently using. What challenges come with that?
Well, I'm chuckling right now because I just worked with the legislation right now in New Hampshire. County jails don't technically, in some of the RSAs that govern law enforcement, fall under the definition of law enforcement, and that's a whole other topic. That's not for today, but we still are recognized. We're recognized on the law enforcement memorial walls, both down in D.C. and in the state of New Hampshire. We are still an active member of the law enforcement community, and that's what we are. We are law enforcement. Now, semantics are semantics, right? I was working on a bill to allow the county jails to have the opportunity to utilize body cameras and vehicle cameras. Now, I can tell you that the initial challenge of that is, and we've been talking about this here at this facility for quite some time now, is they're just doing it to get me. They're trying to implement body cams so they can find out us doing the wrong thing, and that's far from the case. Research and talking with jail administrators who have done this, or police chiefs who have implemented body cameras for their individuals on the road. It's pretty telling that it definitely can decrease an individual's behavior that's interacting with you. And also it ensures transparency, right? If you're operating a jail and you're operating it the way it should be, you shouldn't have to worry about transparency. And again, that's another philosophy of mine. So yeah, when you're trying to implement these big changes of technology, but the realization is technology is where we're at. That's what today is. The we've always done it that way really just doesn't work anymore.
And what I'm hearing you say is, again, why is important, the why, right? And that level of transparency that, you will have, right? So if you're doing things correctly, then there really shouldn't be any fear on either end, right? Whether that's the administration or that's the staff that are actually having to use this new technology. I mean, in many ways, you're saying this could actually help you, when somebody kind of makes a claim and you're able to go back and review information to make sure that that is a valid claim. So, I completely understand where you're coming from with that piece. But you said something important earlier regarding training, right? So how can training be designed to help staff feel confident in adopting new systems?
So I think, with today's what's going on in our staffing in all correctional facilities, training, unfortunately, there's probably a gap in your agency, right? And when I say a gap, you remember when you first started, or you'd have training days with your whole shift, or it ended up being team building and so forth. Now, I mean, you go in a muster or briefing and you're trying to put together 6 people from your shift, and the other one's already out working on the floor, right? So the training, it's challenging right now. And when we're talking about utilizing training, people have to get creative. They have to get creative with it. And we really kind of have to go back. I feel like I just talked and got completely off track from your original question.
But how can training be designed to
Yeah.
help staff feel confident in adopting new systems?
So it could be designed in a few different ways, right? There's ways from, utilizing online training platforms. That's what we do. But you lose the human touch.
Okay.
You utilize the in-person connectivity, right? You lose the in-person connectivity of a trainer working directly with you and being able to answer your questions, when it comes to technology. Even Zoom, we utilize Zoom. We'll have people, companies have their trainers, across the country, and we'll set up training for our staff, and they'll go over the training platforms and, use what's known in a lot of cases as like a sandbox, and they'll go through whatever device or technology that they're using. You got to be flexible, because you're not going to get, with the staffing numbers the way that they are in all of corrections, you're not going to get 20 people in a room anymore. So you have to be willing to be flexible with training. But the training is going to implement it, and use the training as that tool to explain the why. Why are we doing this? It's just like when you're teaching somebody use of force, right? Why is there a use of force?
Right.
Well, we talk about case law associated with it. We talk about state RSAs that are associated with it. And people understand why we have the ability to utilize the force we do, and under what circumstances we have the ability to use the force we do. Implementing a device such as, an inmate tracking system or a bracelet or a new JMS system.
Once a change has been rolled out, how do you make sure it sticks and doesn't fade back into the old way? And I see this a lot with new programs, right, that are implemented and that are pushed out, whether it's coming up from, the courts or commissioners or the legislation. And, there's so many things, right? But inside a jail, once a change has been rolled out, how do we make sure it sticks, doesn't fade back into the old way, or as they say, well, this is the way we've always done it? How can you make sure you have that sustainability?
Well, I mean, if my last boss and mentor is listening or ends up listening to this, he's going to laugh. Because it's a hard concept to understand for such a simple 3 words, and that's trust but verify. So trust that the change that you're implementing is happening, right? You want to let staff understand, or you want to let them be able to have the autonomy, and you see that the autonomy to do the change that you initiated, right? Whether that be a change in classification. Let's use classification for an example. I know
Sure.
that's your wheelhouse. So when I first arrived down here, they used a pretty standard in-house classification model, and we moved on to an objective jail classification model. We utilized the decision tree. Now we don't utilize the software, but we utilize the decision tree, right? Because we can utilize that. So I know Equivant's going to be listening to this, but it allows our case managers to have a validated tool to do their job, right? And so when we first implemented that, there was some challenges to it, because this wasn't the way we've always done things, and it was the understanding. And 4 months later, after when I think things are going good, I even catch myself doing it. A topic or something will come up, and I'll ask the question and say, well, what did it look like on the classification? And you go back and look at it, and it might not be being used.
Looking forward, right? What would you say are some of the most pressing areas where county jails need change management today? Do you feel like it's in policy, technology, or culture?
I go to AJA, And actually, I didn't go this past year, but when you go to AJA and you get up there, and like you said earlier, that it doesn't matter on the size of the county jail. There's systemic problems in a jail that has 4 individuals in it, maybe 10 beds, to a jail that has 7,000 beds, right? There's the common problems and the challenges that they face. And really, I think moving forward, the biggest ones that we're going to continue to face is being able to adapt our operations to the ever-changing, I guess I would say, not only external cultures and factors, but also your internal factors. And your internal factors are, you talked about it earlier, it's a change in workforce. How do you appeal to the new generation of workforce? How do you appeal to getting individuals into our organizations and buying into our actual mission on what we do? Whatever those challenges that you're facing in your organizations over the next few years, they're happening in the rest of the country. And if they're not, then somebody figured out a way to adapt to it and to mitigate that challenge.
What advice could you give county jails as far as borrowing best practices from other industries to kind of improve how they manage change?
It's so cliche, but it's don't reinvent the wheel, right? Just modify it though. If it doesn't work, if it's working somewhere else and you want to implement it, then just modify it if you can, right? And I'll give you an example. In the last facility that I was in, it's really where I learned about programs and inmate programming and the importance of it. And what we didn't have was a lot of stakeholder engagement because we weren't in a city, right? And it was really a self-sustained program. And we, it was great. It was great. But when I got down here, that same model, I mean, it's from the TJC model. It's transition jail community. There's hundreds, thousands of jails across the country using it. We're all using the same thing. We're all just modifying it for us. And we modified it that we have stakeholders down here. We have silver livings. We have external IOPs and PHP and external resources to utilize for these individuals just because of our location, right? It's different. So don't be afraid to take somebody else's. It's pretty simple, right?
One last question.
Yeah.
If you could give one piece of advice to a county jail leader preparing to implement a major change, what would it be?
Well, I'm going to base it off of my mistakes and, things that, even though I listen to them, as others' mistakes, you still make some of them sometimes. And that would be make sure your staff understand the why and why you're doing it. And make sure that the communication flow doesn't stop, right? Communication flows, when it flows one way, it's not effective on the organization. It has to flow down and it has to flow up. Two-way communication in organizations make them successful. So understand your staff, be willing to listen to your staff's feedback, and make sure they understand the why.
Thank you, Joe, for being, for joining us
absolutely.
today on the show. And I just want to thank the audience for joining us as well for today's conversation on change management in county jails. We've heard how difficult, but also how critical it is to guide staff, leadership, and communities through change in environments where safety and consistency come first. Whether it's adopting new technology, shifting policies, or strengthening culture, the key takeaway is clear. Change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen without people. Success depends on communication, training, and building trust at every level. If you found value in today's episode, be sure to share it with colleagues. Subscribe so you don't miss future discussions, and keep the conversation going. Changing corrections isn't easy, but with the right approach, it is possible. Until next time, stay safe, stay engaged, and keep leading the way forward.
This episode of Inside Out, a classification and corrections podcast, was brought to you by Equivon Corrections. For more information regarding classification and/or custody management software solutions that can save your team time and mitigate your facility's risk, visit www.equivon-corrections.com.